Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Smarter Sourcing. My name is John Pavia, and today we have with us Juliana Saretta, the former Vice President for Sourcing and Procurement at Keurig Dr Pepper. Juliana, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John. Hello, everybody.
You had quite a career, and I have 1,000 questions having to do with Keurig and leading the procurement group for such a huge brand that has so many brands within it. But first, I want to start with your own personal journey. Where did it all start? Where did you get the epiphany that you're like, wow, this world of sourcing, procurement, supply chain is something that I like and I can thrive at? So if you could bring us back and bring us forward to present day.
Yes, I think like many people in our line of business, I wasn't thinking about procurement as a career as I was going through college. It was actually not a significant portion of my studies on undergrad. I have a business undergrad degree and following that an MBA. But I started in a trainee program for a company back in Brazil, where I'm from, and it was in the space of procurement, this specific program. They were seeking transformation in the area and inserting fresh talent straight from college that could learn and evolve with the business. And I fell in love with it because it's so dynamic. It has a ton of external exposure, so you become a bit of a conduit for the company in and out. A lot of connections with all the departments inside the enterprise, and that is it. So I was smitten from my first job pretty much and kept evolving my career in the space, eventually branching out to end-to-end supply chain, although the core of my working years has been procurement.
And at what point did the transition come to working and living in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I worked for Mars Incorporated for many, many years. I had actually 2 stints with Mars, 10 years in procurement. Through that period, I moved from Brazil to Argentina and eventually from Argentina to the US. This was in the early 2000s that I made to the US and pretty much stayed here ever since. I left Mars for a brief period and went back in expanded supply chain roles for another 10 years. And from there came to Keurig Dr Pepper most recently. So a series of roles that also had geographical moves associated with those role changes. And that's it. Actually, the majority of my career by now has been acting from the US, either in US based businesses or global businesses.
So you come from a world of overseeing just an enormous amount of spend. I mean, whether it was Mars, then Keurig Dr Pepper, in the billions. And so you always have, I hear from so many people from the supply chain, sourcing, and procurement world, really balancing the competing interests of cost savings and efficiency with delivering high quality and whatnot. What's the thing you think most people in sourcing procurement get wrong in the earlier days of their career, especially if they're not, they didn't go to school for it. This wasn't something they planned on, but because most people I speak with, they're not at university thinking, boy, I want to be going to sourcing and procurement. They end up there. So what do you think that most of the folks who go through this journey get wrong in the early days and maybe throughout?
I think a fallacy can be to think about the role as cost savings and cost savings only. I think that is a misconception. And sometimes people might fall off the career path of procurement thinking that it's too tactical or too focus on that and that only. And it's a very, very nuanced trade. Procurement has strategic impact on every part of the business. It impacts growth, it impacts bottom line, it impacts cash flow, and it has transit through all the different aspects of enterprise. If you are operating on the direct side of procurement, you are influencing the finished good, the finished product. if we're speaking about consumer goods situation. And if you're in the indirect side of procurement, you're influencing how the organization does business in terms of the services it engages, capital, etc. So it has a lot of breadth, and it's quite vital and strategic for any company. And furthermore, I think with the realization that many corporations have had in the recent years of their role in solving bigger problems for society, including climate change and challenges of that magnitude, procurement, I think, became even more relevant. So, to go back to your question, what do people get wrong at the beginning? I think it's that sole focus or that assumption that it's a rather tactical, cost cutting type of gig, when in reality is way broader, more nuanced, and way more exciting, in my opinion, because of that.
So coming from places like Mars and Keurig, both companies have so many different brands. How do you manage real effective category management?
Yeah, I think you're referring to how different would it be if it was a single brand type of situation? Yeah. Well, category management always starts with the needs of the business. So, and regardless of the category we're talking about. So, if it's a raw material that cuts across multiple items and multiple brands, the category lead must seek to understand what each individual brand is looking for. So if it's a service, same way. If we're looking for, let's say, an advertising agency or a media agency, any of those would have to tailor to specific brand needs. So it all goes back to the business in terms of business requirements, and it's not just at the generic total business enterprise P&L level. It is at the brand level. So now I'll give you an example. In the Keurig Dr Pepper portfolio, one of the categories I had was fresh apples, in contrast with, for example, temporary labor, two very different categories, or even advertising agencies, to give you yet another starking contrast of categories. There is one brand in particular within the portfolio, which is Mott's, highly dependent on fresh apples. It's an applesauce, primarily an applesauce brand. It also has juices and other presentations, but the core of the brand is applesauce. So to understand how to cater to that brand when it comes to fresh apples is essential. You know, what does Mott stand for? It's about goodness. It's about a great experience for the children and the parents and the family. And so I think a good category manager for fresh apples, for Mott's applesauce, is one that understands what the brand stands for. And in this case, that person might be sourcing only apples for that particular Mott's brand. But as you take higher order roles in the organization and teams, all the way to the role I had, you got to balance the understanding of brands that have very specific needs, like apples for a category inside applesauce, with brands, maybe Dr. Pepper or Canada Dry or any of the brands, even on the Keurig side, that have very different needs, not to do with apples, but with completely different categories. So you got to be agile, have a keen interest in the consumer, and actually seek to understand what the brand stands for to feed your strategy.
I'm a huge applesauce, Mott's applesauce fan. My family would be laughing right now when they hear you bring up Mott's because that's probably their biggest customer. Do you have a fun fact on applesauce, like how many apples or tons of apples are used each year for Mott's applesauce?
Maybe I'll give you a different kind of fun fact. It's one that I find fascinating, that all the apples, or the vast majority of the apples that go into Mott's applesauce, are cultivated, harvested in upstate New York, where the core factory for the product is. And we source them from about 150 farming families. So it's a very significant part of the community. The apple harvesting and processing for Mott's is very significant in upstate New York, and I would say the brand is very intertwined with that community and those farmers.
Wow, I had no idea. And they're all they're all from upstate New York?
Yeah, pretty much. At some there's certain varieties and sometimes supplementation that needs to come from other parts of the US, like Michigan. But the vast majority, more than 95% of the volume comes from right there in a small radius from family farming that is often third, fourth generation of farming apples.
Amazing. All right, I want to go back. Mars, Keurig, huge organizations, international. In terms of structure, both have similar structures in terms of your groups that you managed?
No, I had very different roles, different types of roles in those two companies. I would say that my last 10 years with Mars were supply chain roles where I had full responsibility for planning, sourcing, manufacturing, and delivery in business units inside the broader Mars. And through those years, I saw a trend inside Mars of more globalization of categories, speaking specifically about procurement, and even in terms of knowledge in other areas. So centralization of engineering resources, for example. So we could think about how to standardize equipment in some of our factories for particular technologies, and procurement globalizing, centralizing for maximum leverage, and also for standardization of specs and things like that. When I moved to Keurig Dr Pepper, very different situation, much more regional business. The majority of the revenues are concentrated in North America, and the US is the lion's share of that. And it was a business that was merging, being born at that moment, if you will, as a combined company of today $15 billion in revenue. So the structure at that point and the challenge at that point was exactly that. How do we understand skill and scale to maximize leverage across these two companies to help accelerate the journey towards value creation after the merger? And it took a little bit until actually Keurig Dr. Pepper migrated towards a more global structure for category management. So, actually, to answer your question, maybe in the end, both companies are landing in the same spot when it comes to leveraging scale and centralizing skills in procurement for key categories. But the journeys were very different, and Mars was, in my experience, ahead of what eventually happened with Keurig Dr. Pepper. Also because Mars is a much more global company and operates in many more different segments.
And still private.
And still private. Yes, owned by the Mars family, who is extremely committed, engaged in the business, and always focusing on this purpose of doing business in a way that makes the world a better place. It's a fascinating company. Very proud of my time there.
And for people and animals.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes, a better place for people and animals.
You brought up, Keurig, and when you were there, it was post-merger, which I had gone through myself on several occasions. What advice would you give someone who is in a similar role that you were at and is in the middle of their companies just come together with another large company? What advice would you give to that person about how to handle that post-merger integration?
Yeah, I think it all starts with listening, attentive listening, generous listening. Anybody on a leadership position that has the task of integrating teams that come from different companies and therefore different cultures has a huge listening job to do. Because people on the trenches, they know where the problems are, where the treasures are, the opportunities, and you gotta unearth that information. So I would say listening attentively and as much as you can across both companies that are being combined is job number one. And then, of course, leverage your past experience, frameworks that you might have used to diagnose the situation. What are the strengths of each side? What are the things that can be borrowed and redeployed? And harness the team around a vision. I think that is one of the missteps that often happens in terms of leadership, and it not just at merger stage, but if you think specifically about merger stage, the allure of the cost optimization that comes from leveraging more money is huge, and it's a prime moment for procurement when you all of a sudden have that combined span and you can go back to the table with key suppliers and have discussions about a bigger pie and what that should translate into in terms of cost efficiencies and benefits. But it cannot just be that. I think teams that perform at their best are teams that actually can engage with a purpose that goes beyond just delivering savings, and are teams that actually feel that their opinions count, that they are listened to in the process. So I think not only the listening bit is important at the beginning of a journey like that, but it must continue throughout. I think a continuous feedback loop between leader and team is a very, very powerful way of keeping folks engaged and therefore delivering at rates that go beyond even what they expected.
It's funny, you got there without me having to prompt you because that's where I was going because in my experience and probably in the, 4 or so times where I was in that situation, you're right. You immediately think and all you're focused on is, "Man, this what an opportunity this is to really drive some cost savings and drive those synergies." But you're right, it's not all about that. It's really it's the allure of that because everybody's thinking the same thing. But that's you went there without me even having to prompt you. In your world, both at in from Mars and over to Keurig in that CPG world, man, it was an education for me to learn how intricate packaging is, and it's a science, and which is why lots of folks have engineers in their packaging department. Was that a world that you got very involved in, and was it a whole education for you?
Yes, I think my journey with packaging very interesting because it started with very basic products. I think the company I mentioned earlier, where I got my first job in procurement as a trainee, produced agricultural chemical fertilizers. And there are only two types of packaging, and they were bags, either they're paper based or they're fiber based, plastic fiber based. Very, very basic packaging formats. And then fast forward, I entered the world of Mars in the pet food space, where we had cans and bags and eventually pouches. And my understanding of the role of packaging became much more nuanced and expanded. And then until the point of Keurig, where the K cup is actually it's packaging, but it's part of the product itself. It's more than just a protection barrier to contain, to transport, which is, many times what basic packaging does. Creates the unit of sale, it protects the product for transportation and for preservation. But when you think about a K cup, it is the vessel in which you brew your cup of coffee. So the interaction between that K cup and the brewer, the appliance, is where magic happens. So think about packaging from, the basic bags for chemical fertilizer in almost bulk format, large quantities, all the way to this very finicky, highly engineered K cup. I would say packaging is in CPG an extremely strategic space, both for procurement as well as marketing and R&D when it comes to product.
I want to turn the conversation a little bit to current trends and what you see coming around the corner that's going to be a game changer for the world of sourcing and procurement. And obviously AI is all over everything, but go a little bit deeper than that. When you look at the craft of real good category management, strategic sourcing, where do you see the game changers coming, and where do you see we're going to feel the impact of that the most in the shortest amount of time?
Yeah, definitely automation and optimization of tasks that are already here. Today I think individual productivity is already highly assisted by AI, and the proliferation of tools and specific tools for different parts of the source to pay process that will apply more speed and will actually elevate other skill sets to the humans in the function. I think that's for sure a fast trend. But I think I want to answer your question a bit differently because somebody asked me this the other day. What did I think was the key skill set that procurement people needed to have considering the changes? And my answer is that we need people that are eager to learn and highly curious. And these are broad. I don't even know, maybe this is not a skill set. Maybe this is a personality trait. But I think that's what it is because the pace of change is so rapid that I cannot say that we need people that are fluent in AI because the AI of today and the AI of 6 months from now will look different because the pace is very high. So what we need is we need procurement professionals that are eager to surf that wave of change, that are curious about what is it all mean, that want to learn. What they learn is gonna keep changing, but it's this interest before the ability, but having the interest, wanting to evolve with the technology, and then gaining the ability because if they have learning aptitude, they will gain the ability and keep evolving. So I think that's the key. It's people that want to learn, that are eager, that are thirsty, that want to do things different, that want to feel part of this wave because this is a revolution like in business that is, I think, comparable to the industrial revolution or the commercial revolution, things that we've seen before our time even, or most recently, the .com and the internet. I think this is that revolutionary. And want you gotta want to be part of it.
I was watching something on CNBC this morning, and they were talking about the predictions market, Polymarket, Robinhood, and whoever was on was talking about the amount that large corporations are using these tools now to predict things like fluctuations in prices of their raw materials and whatnot. And it made me think about this interview and some others that I've done, and the amount of wargaming that's going on now at large corporations trying to plan for contingencies for the next pandemic, for the next crisis that's going on. And some really cool stories of companies that got ahead of like the egg shortage that we had recently, and those companies that were actually saw it coming. You have any cool stories on predictive modeling that you saw and that you've seen in the last few years and how they've advanced and actual impacts that they've had?
That not really. I think the idea of how wargaming gets propelled with AI is fascinating because what AI can do in terms of scenarios and responding to every move that a company would make in a, call it, lab space, right? So this is all about hypothesizing and then creating resilience based on different scenarios. I think that's fascinating. But I think perhaps one story, it's not necessarily related to the advent of AI on wargaming, but just good business practice and being very attentive to trends. I think Keurig has done an outstanding job in diversifying its supply chain for appliances. So the appliances that we sell for brewing, the K cups, are used to be heavily concentrated in China manufacturing. And I think in the first Trump administration, with the indications of different policies for global trade, the business quickly read the moves on the war map and figured that diversification was incredibly important and it was going to become more critical, perhaps vital, if and when these questions about global trade will become more restrictive, the US playing a more restrictive role. So it was incredible to watch how quickly the company mobilized, and this was work that I was not part of. Others in the team were leading, but just observing that forecasting of what if these restrictions become broader, become more expansive? How do we shield our business from it? And sure enough, with the most recent tariffs and expansion of that program in the second Trump administration, I would say the business was incredibly well positioned because they had done a fantastic job of diversifying China and spreading the manufacture of appliances over other areas. So I think that is the job also of procurement and businesses in general, is to be reading the leaves of, and sometimes they're not that enigmatic. Sometimes they're very obvious. I think in the case of the policies of the first Trump administration and how they informed what could become, uh, it was very obvious that that could become a trend, and then actually acting on preparing. So imagine the power now of doing these scenarios with AI, imagining scenarios as such in a more expanded way. I think that's actually a fantastic tool for procurement going forward.
So what's next for you, and what's your preference? Want to go to a big, seasoned, mature organization, or are you at a point where you want to be more entrepreneurial and say, I want to sink my teeth into something that's I got to build an organization.
So it's a great question, and the answer is I am unsure of one path being better than the other at this point. What I can say is I've done large organizations for pretty much all my career, but I also have done entrepreneurial segments inside large organizations. So when I led supply chains at Mars, I was doing that in smaller portions of the business that were sitting in the big corporation. And I liked it a lot. So I am entertaining all kinds of conversations, and I think using this time and this break in my career to be curious, to meet new people, to reconnect with people from the past that have taken different approaches to their career, and we'll see what materializes in the most appealing way, let's say, because I think what I'm looking for is this balance of what I give and what I get. So how I can apply all the experiences I collected over the years, and how exciting whatever I'm doing can be for me, so I can feel like I'm learning and adding value. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, when were you last surprised? And I say that because when you think about Keurig and Mars, they're both now so global. Do you have something you can an experience that you can tell us where? Because I always tell my students and my kids, always be open minded. You never know when you're gonna run into somebody or be in an experience, and you don't think you can. This person or this place can teach you anything, but you'll be surprised what it can teach you. And you've gone all over the world. You've worked with global companies. You've gone through transitions where you've acquired companies, you've merged with companies, and probably gone into many situations where you had a low expectation that someone or some experience was going to really teach you something and give you an aha moment. Do you have one of those?
Yeah, look, I think if we pay enough attention, we are always collecting those nuggets. I think the key is to pay attention to them, and sometimes they have to be a bit abrupt to catch our attention. I think one of the key experiences in my career was actually one that didn't go so well. So I mentioned that I had two stints with Mars, two stints of 10 years each. And in between, I had a brief period with a small company, small manufacturing company of office furniture that was based in Southern California with a supply chain of parts that came from Asia. And I left Mars to go there because I had just finished my MBA and I was looking for breadth. I was up until that point working in the large divisions of Mars and doing, call it slivers of, a category that goes deep and goes across the multiple business units. But what I wanted was breadth, which is usually what you gain when you go through a refresher like an MBA and you realize the enterprise is so fascinating and I wanted to go beyond procurement. And and it was very hard. I couldn't replicate, call it the success I had up until that point in my career. I found it difficult to operate with more limited resources than what I had in the past. So it was a very humbling experience that, looking back was a blip in my career because it was a year, but it taught me so much about me and the things that were non-negotiables for me and how I reacted in different situations. And it actually led me to rethink even things in my personal life and how much focus I put on the career versus other goals in my life. And so I would say very painful experience, short-lived. I walked away because it wasn't healthy for me anymore, but it was deeply transformative. So
Pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone for a while.
yeah, perhaps a little too much, and I think it again it comes with a bit of a cavalier, attitude at that point. It's like, okay, I just finished my MBA. I can do anything. I'm gonna go explore something drastically different, and it's not necessarily like that right now. Of course, a long time since then. I think that's what experience brings is the wisdom of actually assessing the situations and realizing what works, which is why I think at this point in my career with 30 years of background, I can soundly say I can see myself working on an entrepreneur environment, or I can see myself working on a larger organization because I think I have collected the tools to do both. But your question was about, a surprise and a big learning. And I was surprised by the fact that I couldn't navigate that experience as easily as I assumed I could. And again, I think very humbling and extremely important experience in my career.
Interesting. I've gotten the response several times, and I agree with it that pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, regardless of what that might be, is always a good thing in the end because you learn a lot about yourself, even if it doesn't go well. And sounds like your experience. Well, listen, we're out of time, and I really appreciate your time. This has been a cool conversation, and I look forward to keeping track and seeing where you end up. And I know it'll be someplace great, but I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, John. It was lovely to meet you and engage here and stories about our trade and procurement. Appreciate the invitation and till we meet again.
That sounds great. Thanks, Juliana. And to all of our viewers and listeners, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode of Smarter Sourcing. Take care.